Okay, great. So welcome to the Bottom-Up Real Estate Edge session. I'm just going to start standing, but we're going to move this into discussion because we really want to make this a learning session and hear from you. And I think that for all of us, this is a learning process too. And so all of us were very interested in making this starting with sort of a brief introduction and then opening it up for more of a dialogue and sort of discussion with all of you. So we've had a number of conversations over the last day around trends and technologies that are shaping the frontier of real estate. And we're going to spend the next hour with you discussing what I call people-driven development. And colloquially, we could call this bottom-up development. We could call this informal development. Some of you may even call this illegal development. We named this session Bottom-Up Real Estate because while the spatial trends of cities are various, a significant proportion of urban development, and in many cities around the world, the dominant proportion of urban development is driven not by the government or by private developers, but by people. And so I was talking about this over breakfast with a few of you this morning, and they were sort of saying, so what's the what? You know, all development's driven by people, so what makes this any different than any other type of development that we're seeing going around cities? And I would argue that the key difference here is that these are not real estate developers in a formal sense, and this is not necessarily the government coming in and installing housing or installing sort of commercial areas. These are people that are doing the development and sort of driving the development. So let me give you an example, because I want to hold on to this a little bit. In Fenway during major events, for example, you'll undoubtedly see someone sort of pop up with a cooler selling $1 water bottles. And what you see there is, I would argue that you start to see that this is a pop-up commercial spot on the street that's there just during that event. Another example I would say is, from a housing perspective, is someone erecting a house overnight underneath an interstate bridge, which has established the venue to a permanent residential site. And I would argue that both of these are sort of examples of human-driven development that's happening in cities around the world at different scales and at different magnitudes that are fundamentally sort of changing the way in which our cities operate and the way in which our cities are shaped and formed. That's Hota. I think you'll see him over on that side, but he'll speak in a second. So I'd like to do a quick poll and a raise of hands. How many of you are familiar with this concept of urban informality? Yeah? Okay. So we've got around 5% of you maybe? This is great. I think this will lead to a great conversation. And we really want to open this up for a dialogue in a second. We're talking about this here because the magnitude of these dimensions have a profound effect on the way in which cities are growing. And for the sake of clarity in this conversation, I want to separate this reality into two key components. One is informal settlements. These you can sort of call slums or favelas or urban informality that's happening all around the world. Hota will speak a lot about the trends on this. And just to give you a sense of this scale, UN Habitat estimates that 1 in 8 people in the world live in informal settlements. And that continues to grow and shift. That sort of numbers is not sort of changing actively. And the other piece I want to call out is informal economies, which is what Rita's going to talk about. This can be called the gray economy, the cash economy, or the shadow economy. There's many names and sort of terminologies for this. But I would say that what we're speaking about specifically here is income generation, irrespective of sector, that is unregulated by the government. This economy runs everything from recycling businesses, massive construction, food markets, and transportation. And again, to give you a sense of the size of scale, the estimates vary, but arguably around 2/3 of the world's working population are working in the informal sector, just to give you a sense of that scale. And so arguably why we talk about this as the informal sector, it's really the dominant sector of the economy that's really shaping our economic trends and our cities on a daily basis. And that number is, there's a journalist named Robert Neuwirth who has done a lot of research around this area. He sort of estimated back in 2010 that the total value of the informal economy is worth close to $10 trillion if it was a singular country with all of its GDP classified in one country's GDP. And that would make it on par and sort of competing with the United States and China for sort of first, second, or third, depending upon where you sort of estimate those numbers have changed over the last decade. And so I want to ground this really into, when we're talking about informality, we're talking a lot about what's not regulated by the government. And while there's a lot more nuance to that than we have time to cover here in this session, what's important here is that this type of urban development is responding to key trends in cities around the world, predominantly human migration and predominantly income inequality. And I think that that's a call to developers, planners, designers to really start to think about what are the new models of the future that start to shape our future cities and are definitely shaping the cities as we know it now. And I want to ground this in two questions that comes up a lot when I'm talking about this, which is, one, where is this happening? Fundamentally, this is oftentimes a phenomena that we're talking about in developing or emerging economies. But I would argue that this is happening around the world. Reed and I, for instance, just put in a proposal to Vancouver, which is asking about how do they respond to unpermitted street vending in Vancouver that they have made sort of new markets for, but continues to keep growing within Vancouver. London is now sort of putting out proposals and responses to sort of say, how do we not only respond to affordable housing and affordable commercial sites, but really start to think about survivalist micro enterprises as key links to making our cities affordable and providing affordable services goods at the same time. The second question that comes up a lot is this going to change? This is something that's raised a lot. I think there's a lot of conversation around it, and you can talk to scholars which can deliberate and debate this all the time. But I would argue that this is not going to change. This is not a matter of economic development. This is really a fundamental reality of our cities and of our economies. And the estimates say that a lot of the new work that's created around the world is informal. So UN Habitat said that 85% of new jobs are happening in the informal economy. And that's just to give you a sense of the scale, because I think this is something that we're not always present with in our cities. From a real estate lens, this value is substantial. It's not to be overlooked. We can look at the estimates and sort of the numbers, and we can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion. But I think it's a really important thing for all of us as activators and built environment practitioners to be aware of and thoughtful of how it challenges us to better understand what's happening in the street and also start to create new models for city development. So that's kind of my introduction. As I mentioned, I want to open this up for a discussion because we're really interested in hearing from you. We want to focus this session on four main themes, which is, one, what are the characteristics and the trends of informal urban development? Two, what are the examples of development that recognize or respond to these trends? And three, how do these trends shape your approaches to real estate development? Or how should they shape our approaches to the research that's coming out of MIT and out of UC Boulder? And the final one is really looking at the future. What should and can the shape of our cities look like? And what are the models that are going to lead us there? So I'm going to turn this over to Hota, who's going to speak more about his work. If you have questions throughout this first three introductions, please write them down, and then we will open this up to a dialogue after Hota, Dennis, and Rita have spoken. Hota, I've had the pleasure of knowing for the last 5 years. He was here at MIT for his master's degree and his PhD, and also was a lecturer here. And he's now at UC Boulder, an assistant faculty member in the environmental design program. His work focuses on sustainable urban growth and specifically dwells at the intersection between urban informality, slums, and urban violent conflict. So he's looming in from above from Barcelona, so sort of big brother-like to join us for this meeting. Hota, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear us, Hota? Oh.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Hota, it's all you.
Hello?
Yep.
Yes.
We're watching you from above. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
you can hear us.
Sounds scary.
I'm turning the spotlight over to you if you're ready to talk about your work.
Hey, Hota,
Maybe we can send him.
Yes.
can you bring up your sharing screen to present?
Cool. All right, a little bit of a hiccup, but we will get there. Trust me. We practiced this bright and early this morning and then late last night. So the technology is possible, even at MIT. Sometimes we debate.
There we go.
All right, great. Your presentation's up.
Perfect.
You can go ahead and present.
Perfect. So, welcome everybody. I'm very excited to be here. Sorry to not be able to be there in body, but I'm really excited anyway to start this small quick presentation. And I wanted to say thank you for the department to invite me and present also. So today I want to do something a little bit radical. I want to talk about this strange idea that informality is a really important real estate issue, maybe one of the most important real estate issues on the present. And I want to convince you of that and the need that we have of creating tools to intervene in these spaces of both as markets, but also to learning of a new form of development. And to that, I really wanted for you to understand the scale of what we're talking about. Each one of these diagrams represent the entire urban form of the planet, every city in the planet in three different periods, 1950, 2000, and 2050. And the white part of that diagram represent the amount of informal settlements of what we call pejorative slums. And what is very clear from this, not only that population is growing exponentially, is also how slums of informal settlements are taking a larger portion of that is the urban environment. So much that today 1/3 of all urban environment is an informal settlement. And by the year 2050, half of every city in the planet will be an informal settlement. A total of 3 billion people will be living in that we call slums, making it today and even more in the very near future the most common form of urbanization of the planet. So this, of course, is distributed unequally across the planet. But what I want to bring today to the table is that this form of development that we know very little about it is the most common one, but it also represents an enormous value. If you use Hernando de Soto's ideas about the value of the real estate market, buried in the grounds of informal settlements across the world, today we are talking about a market of $6 trillion worldwide. And that is probably an understatement of really what is happening there. A market that is already happening, that is existing, that is very healthy, a real estate market that is very healthy for informal dwellers, but one that we haven't been able to tap into it. So this is very important, not only because it's big, but it's also because the way that cities are actually built. And what you're seeing here is the mapping of informal settlements in the city in a Latin American city of Medellin, Colombia, from the year 2050 and 1950 to the present. And one thing that becomes really clear when you look at all these informal settlements appearing and disappearing or becoming more formal as time passes is that 40% of that city actually is the product of an informal settlement. The city is built through the process of creating slums. And through the time, these slums are becoming integral part of what the city actually is. One key part of this diagram that you're seeing in the screen right now, it represents 4 important projects of investment, state investment on those informal settlements that you saw before. And what is incredible about this is that even traditional investment of states money into these places create incredible gains in terms of in traditional terms. In Medellin, for example, represented a 300% growth on just formal markets, and it also represented for the formal city the rediscovery of tapping into a tourism market that it didn't existed before. So this was an incredible opportunity, just with very low investment on improving the quality of informal solvents. So from the traditional aspect, there's already forms in which we could tap into the value of these places. My work is focused on trying to understand this geography that is so unknown. So I created this atlas of informality in which we are mapping informal settlements across the world, and our idea is to understand what is unique about these places, and what we could learn from them, and what is happening over there. One thing that we have really learned is that these places are constantly changing. They are becoming better every year as we visit. Like, for example, this is a favela in Rio de Janeiro over 3 decades. This is the same street over 3 decades, and with almost non-investment from the state, the street actually have the buildings around the street have become more solid and more structural and of better quality and better set of amenities. And what you have seen is a very slow but gradual program of self-improvement of their space and creating a street, a very kind of more traditional street at the end of that process. That is becoming an important aspect of this. The other is element of change. Of course, is not only in how they look and how the units look, but actually how they are continuously expanding. And this is something that we did by mapping around 400 informal settlements across the world, and we realized that these places are constantly changing and expanding at very interesting rates. Of course, at different rates across the world, and what you're seeing here is a percentage of growth across the world. Latin America seems to be the slower growing geography. Africa is definitely leading the pace in how that growth actually happens, but in India is on a second place. But in general, we have learned that informal settlements, the ones that we already know, the ones that are already there, that comprise 1/3 of the urban form of the planet, grow at 0.05% per year, and that was an incredible kind of a discovery of finding that these places that already exist are actually changing, and they're growing. And what that means in terms of real estate, I wanted to create visually what this means. It means that every year, just the expanding nature of existing neighborhoods that are informal settlements create an area larger than the metropolitan New York. So that's what these 8,000 hectares actually are presented here, is that the incredible amount of land that is actually created just from the simple expansion of these informal settlements. So I wanted to leave with two important ideas. One was, of course, that informal settlements is the most common form of urbanization of the planet. And the second is that we haven't tapped as a market on how to take place in this geography that is very open to innovation in terms of how to develop. And I think new disruptive technologies today are opening the space for that kind of understanding of how this market could actually work. As Uber and Airbnb have done through markets that distribute amenities through informal systems, like you borrowing your house or you borrowing your time and your car to travel. Informal settlements are doing things that are similar, and we haven't found the financial mechanisms to actually tap into and actually profit and at the same time to help these communities to actually settle down and continue enhancing their environments in a better space. And with that, I wanted to give that as I think a piece of discussion of how that in informal settlements could be this place of innovation on future as a future real estate market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hota. I'm going to turn it over to Rita Kaidri, who's a doctoral student here within the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Rita has been doing a lot of her work, both in her master's degree and her doctoral degree here, looking at patterns of informal income generation and bringing sort of new modes of data collection and also analysis to that.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. So what I want to kind of talk about is when I was doing my master's thesis, what struck me was when people talk about bottom-up self-help development, they generally think shelter. And that's for good reason, because housing is, like incremental housing or building housing yourself is a very large and important facet of survival within any city. But what is often overlooked are the economies and circuits of exchange that people develop, completely autonomous from the state and from other formal private spheres. These are mostly small-scale, informal, flexible enterprises that are constantly and dynamically responding to seasons, customer demand, foot traffic. So this can be anything from a tiny corner shop in an informal settlement to a street vendor in New York selling homemade hot chocolate, to a waste picker roving the streets and offering their services for hire. What I want to do is differentiate this idea from the illegal or shadow economy, because in the economies we're talking about, in the informal economy, the goods that are being sold or the services that are being sold are completely legal. The only thing that is considered illegal is the mode in which they are being distributed. In terms of scale, this is no small drop in the bucket. This happens globally. Our work has taken us from New York to Singapore to Durban, and small-scale commercial activity has been thriving in all of these cities. In Durban, for example, one conglomeration of informal traders that we study generate an estimated turnover of $8 million per month. And of course, in Rand, this is significantly a lot more. Unfortunately, it's only recently that we started learning more about this, similar to what Hota was talking about with informal settlements, because the nature of these businesses is very difficult to understand. They're constantly in flux, they're constantly changing. And for a large part of our history, no one has really cared about these informal income generation activities either. So our work at CREATE has focused specifically on researching the physical spaces where such flexible commercial activity takes place, as well as exploring alternate policy frameworks, which could help us both integrate these activities and economies within our urban framework, but also at the same time keep in mind the myriad of stakeholders that we have within the city. So I want to briefly talk about two things. One, consider why we should pay attention to such bottom-up commercial development, and two, discuss the different forms of responses cities have had and what cities can do for these informal economies. So first, why should we pay attention to the self-help economy? We have found in our work, one, that street vendors and traders are actually very, very efficient with their use of space. They have high density, low square footage stalls. This is especially valuable today, we feel, as commercial real estate becomes more and more expensive and current forms of standardized rentals become less and less sustainable. For instance, in Durban, between 5,000 and 8,000 individual traders trade in multiple markets, displaying incredible product segmentation. Each market specializing in herbs, one market specializing in CDs, one market specializing in cooked food. But each trader trades only from a site of around 20 to 50 square feet. That's the stall space each individual trader takes. And their collective turnover is around $8 million monthly. There's also significant income generated from these small spaces if you think about all the supply chains that they're integrated with, all the ancillary services that they hire, like delivery boys, water delivery, site cleanup. Two, this is also a very flexible form of exchange, which does not need to be anchored to one spot, which means that it can constantly and dynamically respond to changing conditions within the city. In our work in New York, we found that street vendors were responding to, so this is mapping of street vendor locations in 3 different neighborhoods in New York. Street vendors were responding to customer demand and changes in foot traffic, and also things that people would want in different times during the day, in the morning, afternoon, and evening, but also seasonally. So vendors were sort of closing up shop in winter, popping up again in summer, somewhere in the middle in fall. And again, we feel this is extremely important in as retail evolves and as customer demand patterns become more and more customized almost. And with the advent of online shopping, this is, we think, an interesting opportunity to explore how we can tap into an economy like this to bolster our urban retail landscape. It's also a very scientific form of exchange. The development of these economies are very complex and impressive, given that most of these people have often no formal training and no formal institutions backing them up. So they themselves, the individual is responsible for choosing a location, developing those spaces for exchange, procuring goods, tapping into supply chains and networks, appropriating amenities, designing their own furniture, and all the very kind of specific technical decisions that go into formal businesses. The only difference is that this business is happening without and often in spite of formal regulatory processes. And that's why what we have found is that these vendors and traders are almost an efficient source of getting to the pulse of the economy and changing neighborhoods, because they're so mobile and because they themselves are responsible for making all these decisions. They're very in tune to how neighborhoods are changing and where they should locate and when. So how have cities and governments responded to these? There are a myriad of ways. Again, people have responded to informal exchange. You can go the part of New York, which strictly regulates and licenses these vendors. The problem is then that the city has only 5,000 licenses for vending, and approximately there are around 25 to 30,000 vendors in New York right now. The cost of a single license, because of this restriction, has now in the black market can go up to $8,000 for approximately 20 square feet of space. Another way to deal with it is what Singapore did, where they wholesale took all the vendors and put them into these kinds of markets called hawker centers, sort of very hygienic, very standardized, and they fixed the vendor location across time and space. The problem, and they subsidize these also to make sure that the rents are affordable. The problem with this is, as with any kind of government intervention, as times change, how does the government keep up with competing land uses, pressures of the market? So something we found was that over time, there's been a huge variation of rentals for hawker centers in Singapore. And also the hawker centers, the activity and the value of the real estate around the hawker centers has been changing. So it's unclear how the government could respond to something like this. Whereas if the vendors were sort of free to roam, they would have changed their patterns and their activities according to the real estate market changing. And the third form is something that Durban has done, which is acknowledge the presence of these vendors and invested with them into their spaces. One upgrade of a market, around 700 vendors, one upgrade of the market resulted in an increase in turnover by almost 400%. And the upgrade was very simple, sort of bathroom stalls, cleaning up the space a little bit, and giving them proper shelter and amenities in the market. And there are pros and cons of using any of these strategies, and we can chat more about this in the discussion section. But the main takeaway that I would want to leave you with is that researching and putting numbers on these economies is increasingly becoming more and more important as they grow in magnitude and importance within our urban landscape.
Cool. Thank you, Rita.
Okay.
Right.
So I'm just going to give Dennis a quick introduction. We asked him to sort of like pull together the ends and start to bridge the conversation between what we've presented and what you're talking about. So Dennis has many hats, and if you don't know him, you should know him, and you'll also hear from him later today. But he is both a faculty member within the Center for Real Estate and within the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and an associate dean within the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and is the faculty lead for DesignX, which is the incubator for innovation around built environment.
Come to say. Whoops, is this on? Yeah. How's that? Okay, great. Come this afternoon. That's an advertisement. Well, it's going to be pretty simple for me to pull these two issues together because it's exactly what my notes were, and talk a little bit about why we should all be paying attention to this. I was kind of slightly amused. Certainly none of you are very funny, but slightly amused when only a couple people said they were part of the informal economy. So how many people took an Uber in the last week? Wow, you guys are really tough. Okay, Airbnb. How many of you have WeWork on your properties or know of somebody who's working in WeWork? That is all the informal economy. And it is a powerful force in cities. And my area is city making. How does real estate and urban design and government, but particularly real estate because we're the deployers, right? We're the people who actually make it. How cities are going to change in the future, and then how we can track our investments and where we put our energy, and how real estate products will change because of these social and economic forces. So just to summarize, there's kind of two reasons to be thinking about this. One, it's a huge market. The emerging market is titanic and will dwarf let's say the informal market will eventually dwarf the formal market. How can I say that? Well, I was in China when everyone was pretty much poor. And no one would have believed that economy could do what it's done. And particularly in Korea, look back at Seoul in the 60s. You would be amazed, shocked. Okay, all of these informal places, as Hota was talking about, are all regenerating, improving, and they're permanent parts of the cities. And like, those beautiful little villages on the Greek islands, someday people will visit them and say, oh, look at this. Came informally, it's so beautiful. The architecture's wonderful. Okay, so the investment, though, the opportunity in real estate lies at, we have two economies now. We have the informal and we have the formal. And now there is beginning to be a whole set of businesses and institutions that are linking the two together. Because they do have a different way of operating. They are different economies. There are different sets of rules. And there's a really smart group of people out there. We have one in DesignX who are developing the ways financially, in terms of development and so forth, to link the two together. There's a lot to be done there. But if I get back to the other reason to pay attention here, it's because this is the model of the future city. Sorry to say that. You will say, oh my God, we're all going to live in a slum. No, we are all going to have to live in vastly more efficient urban settlements. The current model, the 20th century model, is unsustainable. We just had a panel on sustainability. Okay, we're trying to eke out little micro percentages by making buildings smart and this and that. But basically, the whole infrastructure and cities that we're building are heading towards a cliff. This is also why Uber and other new forms of service and development are emerging, because they are more efficient. They use the resources of the city much more efficiently. And as you know, follow the money, follow the resources. That's why WeWork is, and we can all argue about WeWork and what's happening in office, but that's one reason why in New York it's the second largest user of tenant of office space now. I mean, in what? A blink of an eye, 5 years. So the power of this, and it's not going to go away, it's only going to get more innovative and more intensive. The power of this is actually going to change the way we do real estate towards a more informal way of providing what we all provide, the physical form and the social form of the city. Now, we tend to have an overview here. And you can talk about Uber and we can have a big discussion, and cities are having problems and this and that, but it's still growing fantastically. And we can talk about Airbnb, we can talk about WeWork, we can talk about the issues in retail development these days. Nobody really knows where to go. You can look at production even. And it's returning in bits and pieces pretty powerfully now into cities. If you put all this together, what you see is a fragmentation occurring of the old systems in the city. And they're recombining, this is Bill Mitchell's term, recombining in many kind of interesting ways. But all of this fragmentation is a fragmentation towards more informality in the way we make deals, in the way we progress, eliminating the middle person and making peer-to-peer transactions. This is what is significant about blockchain. We talked about blockchain yesterday. Blockchain is an incredibly powerful tool of maintaining authenticity and permanence of transactions in the midst of its transformation to informality. We needed banks to give mortgages. We don't need banks anymore. We can crowdsource or get the money from multiple sources. So I don't have a solution, but I think if you keep that in mind, then you can begin to understand some of the transformations in the real estate products like office space. Oliver Carr and I at dinner were having a discussion about, the tenants want smaller leases, they want more flexible space, okay? Smaller space per person, right? It tracks exactly with what Rita and Hota are saying. So I guess maybe that's enough to tie it together. I do think if you begin to look into this, you will see both an understanding of what's happening in the formal city, an appreciation for the enormous amount of wealth that's being created informally, no banks, no developers, or actually there are developers, but they're a different kind. And also maybe a way of thinking in the future about your own business and development. So,
Absolutely.
thanks.
Thank you. All right, we're going to open up this for discussion. So we've got John is in the audience, and he is also a lecturer here at Center for Real Estate and the co-founder of MIT Creates. He's going to help us navigate and sort of open this up for discussion. So any questions in the audience? Just wanted to start with, are there any sort of clarifying questions too? Do you want to start? Yeah, please do. Let's get a mic coming to you, because then Hota can hear us when we talk into the microphone, and so then we can have his voice sort of also in the conversation.
Hi, my name's Tim. I'm with the Boston Planning and Development Agency.
Yeah.
I guess we talk about Uber and WeWork and sort of companies on sort of the private side. In terms of government, have you seen any governments or policies that have done a good job of either formalizing or tolerating informality in a way? I think of sort of, single-family zoning kind of closes off opportunities for wealth creation and sort of development, for ordinary people that maybe want to add a unit to their house, or other types of zoning restrictions and sort of licensing sort of restrictions that prevent people from opening a small business, either in terms of a location or sort of, when we talk about permit fees that, become like astronomical on the black market. So, I'm interested in the United States, but obviously there are places all over the world that we can learn from in terms of, cities or governments or policies that have sort of done a good job of kind of bringing that informality into a more formal way that opens up opportunities for folks.
Hota, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that would be great. We are actually doing a panel in Boulder, in C Boulder, about the specifics of this issue. Because Boulder, as a city with tons of students and very expensive real estate, is having this trouble of trying to figure out non-conformity in a context of a very strict regulatory system. So the idea is how places like this could learn from other places. And I think that sadly there are not real good examples of what is happening. What we've seen specifically from Latin America is an acceptance of these places and a flexibility of the planning regulation that allows over time to allow these places to be improved. What I think the larger danger exists is in the lack of capacity of our planning regulatory system to adapt to not only the economical situations, like for example in Boulder is student residences that are extremely expensive, but also to cultural issues. In San Diego, Tijuana region, for example, what you have is a large demographic of Latin Americans that are trying to use the space in ways that accommodates to their culture, and how the regulatory systems are very difficult to actually adjust to those ways of understanding how culture uses the space. So I think what we need to figure out is ways to be more flexible in those systems. And I think the key idea here, from what happens in Latin America and from what I see happening in the United States, is that we need to include more these communities that are breaking the law into the process of actually figure out new instruments. And for example, one U.S. example could come to bear is in San Diego, when we were working with a community just across the border in the city. The idea that came out was when an overlay zoning that allowed them to be able to have the flexibility of having their units with higher levels of density that will allow them to actually retrofit the entire neighborhood. So that's sort of what I wanted to answer, but sadly there are not great answers to that question.
Yeah, I can jump in to that. I completely agree with Hota. In the informal economy side of things, the problem is planning as an ethos is about order and control and regulation. So how does that respond to an economic system that is inherently dynamic and in flux, and rejects the sort of standardization and order of planning? And that's the tussle that a lot of governments have had to face. As I was mentioning in my talk, so Singapore is considered in general the model for how you should deal with street vending, as an example. So they did legalize vending, but from specific spaces in the city, these kind of hawker centers. The problem though is that when you fix itinerant vending in space and time, that reduces the vendor's ability to respond to changing city dynamics. So that's a model that is being followed increasingly in the global south, but there is no proof that is what that it works. Another model is Durban, where there is co-investment in spaces. So the city says, yes, we recognize that this vending is happening, and we will let the vendors also take the lead a little bit in developing business intelligence and respect that intelligence, and then facilitate that trade, whether that's through designing better amenities, whether that's through more flexible policy. They're not quite there yet. There's obviously a lot of tension in that policy making also. But that's one way that could be a solution. And then, of course, there's London and Portugal and now Vancouver, who's at least started studying this phenomena. Before, cities just wanted to either turn a blind eye or bulldoze those informal markets. So now at least cities are saying, okay, the first step is understanding this, what is going on, and then the second step is once we understand it, then we can start making policies.
It's an interesting statistic, I guess I can say, that a third, close to a third, maybe it's a quarter of the hotel stays in New York City are an Airbnb, and it's illegal. I've stayed with several friends down in New York. So I think you're finding a new economy banging up against the rigidity of the formal city. Now, Boston, this is across all dimensions. Boston, I think, is doing, one place this is happening is in the smart city arena. Okay, so the first idea about smart cities is let's go out and hire Cisco to wireless up our city. And they come in with a package and it's out of date in 2 years and so forth. Boston has done a very good job, is doing a very good job. In fact, it's a model of trying to ground source technological ways or digital ways of managing and governing the city. And it is an experiment, but there's a lot of great things that are going on in Boston around this one piece. So maybe we have to begin in that way rather than trying to think of standards, which is 20th century machine age is all about standards. You got to have those lights have to be at that standard whether they blind me or not, okay? Every street light has to be on, even though there may not be people in 1,000 miles. This is what we mean by inefficiency. Okay, so maybe we can begin to crowdsource or ask people how to manage Airbnb and all these, and how to balance and work at it that way. But there is as I said, there is a struggle, but also an incredible challenge to knit together formality, which has its pluses and minuses, and informality.
All right, got a question right here? Come on, we can all hear you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kim Summers with Ivanhoe Cambridge. We spoke a lot about the role of governments. Could you talk to the role of either landlords or real estate developers? What should they do to bring this informal economy to the formal economy, and is it something that we should wish for? Thank you.
You want to take that?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's a question of being aware that this change is happening. I don't think any one of us in particular can change that. I don't think government can change it because it's a social change that is being enabled by digital technology. I can tell you, I've worked in informal settlements. Everybody has a smartphone. Every person. They don't all use the smart features, but every single person. So they have at their fingertips the computing power of anybody, more than anybody in the world 10 years ago, let's say. So what does that mean? These people are not dumb. They're smart. They're making enterprises, and they're going to build their communities. So the development community, as I mentioned, I was talking with Oliver, has to recognize these trends and innovate in ways that can, so in leasing for an office tower, for example, you might conventionally lease half of it and non-conventionally lease the other half, and begin your own process of sharing and short-term leases, a whole gradation of leases. You don't have to wait for a WeWork. They're just commodifying what is a big change. I think there's probably 10 times more innovation in the development community that's waiting to be tapped into. And the interesting thing about the informal economy is it requires less investment, less walls, less segmentation, right? Reliance on the cell phone rather than wiring up the building necessarily. So the real estate industry needs to take a lead in this, or it will just be following along and have to buy products. But it can, and I think it is. There are a lot of interesting projects out there, and it tends to go by product. So in retail, there's a lot of interesting experimentation now about fragmenting retail and making it changeable and dynamic, experience-oriented, for example. But it's also in office. It's in all the real estate products.
Maybe just say something. So I teach like entrepreneurship, and what we're at the Center for Real Estate, and what the School of Architecture, which this is under, has the Media Lab, it has Dennis's DesX, it has all sorts of facilities. And the answer I would give to this person's question right here is it's a work in progress. There's lots of research going on informality within the MIT, within all the parts of MIT. And I think what was said before is what we're really looking for is I had some businesses in the built environment. And my first question would be, so what does it mean to me? What's it mean to me as a real estate person? And that's really a question that's in process. And what we really want to try and achieve, not just now, but going forward with Create and other places, is to work with you in collaboration to solve those problems, to help direct our research so that it makes sense, that it works for you. So because I have a great faith in the private sector solving problems. I think it always has and it always will. And so we need that private sector to tell us what it is that you're running into. If you have a building and you have what might have before you came in here, people laying across your front door selling tomatoes, that might affect your business. It's not antisocial, it's not discriminatory, it's a fact. The fact is we can solve that together. What we need from you is what are those issues you're facing so that we can make sure we direct the research and then we get that research back to you. So please stay in touch with us about these things because it is a work in progress and it's not a hypothetical, it's a reality. It's coming. The question is, can we solve it and how can we solve it? And how can we solve it in some sense of equality for all participants? So that's my speech.
If I can jump here, I would love to say one thing. The first thing, I think the question, not to disrespect to the person who made the question is not if informality needs to be formalized. I think that's not the question because informal settlement, we need the informal economy to coexist with the formal economy. What is really important for me, and one of the things that I think we as the formal who are created products or the real estate entrepreneurs, what is important that we could give to informal communities is this idea of representation or visibility. So if I have asked you, any one of you today, what is the most common real estate product on the world? None of you will have said an informal settlement. And I think not being realistic about that's really the condition of our planet, it shows that us, as being in the real estate field, need to become involved with this phenomena. And I think what we could give to those that live in this market that is very healthy, the real estate market in informal settlements is extremely healthy and organized. What we could give to them is the visibility that they don't have and not have it for the last 100 years.
And I want to pick up on what Hota is saying. So what I find really interesting is like where can traditional business models fit into what's happening with informality. So you look at products and services, for instance, Procter & Gamble has entire product lines that are sold solely through street vendors and solely through like spaces which are like 4 by 4
Really?
foot businesses.
It's amazing.
And they depend on those street vendors sort of worldwide in oftentimes emerging markets, but I would say also there's equivalents here in the United States and also in Europe. And they've created those like specifically for street vendors. And so I think it's a really interesting example of starting to understand what are the trends in informality and sort of trying to change and sort of reflect and build sort of your business model to that. Another really interesting example that I had just heard, and I was just down in Mexico City, hanging out with some good friends, and a good friend was sort of saying that he goes to a market every week and there's an architect that will give effectively like roll-up designs for houses, and he will design your house in 1 hour. And so you can either buy house designs sort of off the market of the designs that he's already designed, or he will sort of custom design one for you in 1 hour. And suddenly you sort of have these like micro designs, micro sort of real estate development, and micro sort of product delivery that's happening in conjunction with multinational corporations, but also sort of singular individuals that have sort of technical knowledge and sort of skill sets and experience to also work with communities at the same time. And I think that these are sort of the really interesting spaces for innovation and observation at the same time. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think the important part is to change the narrative that a lot of us have around informal economy specifically, and I think informal settlements also. In New York, the highest complaints against street vendors come from landlords and real estate developers because they feel like a vendor's presence is degrading the value of the property. And that's not necessarily true. In Soho, for example, we've seen that the street vendors that sell art are actually a great draw of foot traffic to that area. And that then enhances the business of the formal retailers there. So the question is, how do we sort of coexist and change the narrative of, this is poverty, this is chaos, this is dirty, a lot of these kind of pejorative terms that we associate with the informal economy.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to take one final question, and then we've got to wrap up to keep us on time.
Name is Kitchley. I'm a financial anthropologist. And all this new informal fragging approach is very good to take care of those informal economics. My question is it seems to me that a lot of development in the cities that I see is very high end because that's where the money is. So developers are going to go for high end, raise the rent, raise the price of property, and a lot of people are going to get marginalized. They're going to push aside. So I'd like to see some governmental or more new economic model that would bring the life back to the city. Look at Flint, Michigan. It's dying. I mean, just like devastated. So people are going to be marginalized. They're going to sell in the streets. But that is one solution, but it needs a more drastic countermeasure that is not happening in today's developers' high-end market. San Francisco, along the shoreline to LA, this guy from Hoover Institute says, we have medieval economy. Along the shoreline is 1%. You go inside to the land is homeless. So there are some drastic changes that has to be made in a macro scale. And I do think this informal economics is great, with it driven by technology, but we definitely, I think, need more.
Time for one more question? Or do you have a response?
No, I would just say I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think there's a lot of need for new development models. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah. One more question.
Okay.
Yeah, I disagree with 80% of that, so I just thought it would be fun to have a little counterbalance to what this gentleman just said.
Yeah.
Arguably the most successful economy in the country for attracting middle class and lower middle class people is Houston, which only has two things going for it. doesn't have zoning, doesn't have government control. It has property rights, and it has, thriving entrepreneurship, and it has rule of law, which the countries and the places cited on the screens didn't have. If you talk about San Francisco and New York, which the gentleman brought up, those are fabulous examples of over-regulated economies where you have left only two types of people: rich people and the people who serve them lunch, because you have very fettered development. So the structure is the problem. If you let people solve problems, the informal economy thing, that's a great concept. The government steps in thing is the rule in most places in the world that you just outlined that have this problem. Anyway, I don't want to soak up everybody's time. It's just, that was difficult to listen to. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that dialogue. And let's keep this going. I know all of us are sort of actively working on this, and so would love to have a conversation going offline. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you to the panelists. Jota, thank you for joining us. And we'll be back in 60 minutes. We have lunch outside, and we'll be back in this room to talk about China.